What if a book emerged? We didn't necessarily know how, when, or why. It is by one author, but it is of such length that it cannot be finished in a lifetime. Even if you're a Harold Bloom, 1,000 page a day kind of guy,
Yeah.
it's known that you could start in the middle, you could do highlights, but you cannot finish the book within one life because you will die of old age. What
That's
would
why
we do
Bloom
with
reads.
this thing?
Of course, that's why Bloom reads so badly, is because he reads too quickly. Let's get that first established. Slow
He claimed
reading,
1,000 pages an hour. That's what he
absurd,
claimed.
absolute absurdity. Actually, what Milo's just mentioned there is a very powerful idea behind what the book might represent. Okay, it's a Borgesian thing. He even writes a story about it, but there is a way in which every piece of writing ever made seems to be involved in some sort of loop, permanent loop that will never quite run out. And certainly, once we learn to be readers, if we get the bug, we just never stop. We just keep reading. When you read one book, you are also rereading all of the other books that you read before that, in order to be able to read that book.
Solomon and Smith. Welcome to Solomon and Smith. You're about to watch a conversation between me, Milo, and Brian Cummings. Brian Cummings is a professor of English and related literature. What is related literature, you ask? Well, it seems to include the entire history of philosophy. The history of the Renaissance, the history of Renaissance humanism in particular. Brian seems to have read everything Erasmus has ever written. And Erasmus isn't one of these guys who wrote 3 sentences. I mean, that is a mad bookshelf. Also poetry and poetics, sort of literary linguistics. Brian was a great guest. Brian just could talk about anything at infinite length and really sounds like he knows what he's talking about. I reached out to Brian asking whether we could discuss the history of the book. That remains the sort of main topic of this conversation, but I was thinking that this conversation was going to be, printing press stuff. Where do they get the ink? how do they get the paper? All of that kind of thing. And then with maybe a kind of epilogue on how that might have affected Shakespeare, the reception of Shakespeare, the history of the first folio. The conversation ended up being infinitely more interesting than that. Now, this is a conversation about the book as a sort of quasi-spiritual object. Brian's one of these atheists who's devoted his entire life to the study of religion. An interesting demographic, a demographic I very much approve of. We talk about the book as a sort of second soul. The book isn't merely confined to the pages, to the physical object. The book exists somewhere between the reader and the read text. It's a third thing. It's a liminal thing that exists between the reader and the read, between the symbol and the symbolized. There is nothing more like experiencing another person's consciousness than reading a book. Yeah, I just thought this was a really, really wonderful conversation. It tangented off in the most interesting directions. We are absurdly accustomed to the miracle of a few written signs being able to contain immortal imagery, involutions of thought, new words with live people, speaking, weeping, laughing. We take it for granted so simply that, in a sense, by the very act of brutish, routine acceptance, we undo the work of ages, the history of the gradual elaboration of poetical description and construction, from the tree man to Browning, from the caveman to Keats. What if we awake one day, all of us, and find ourselves utterly unable to read? I wish you to gasp not only at what you read, but at the miracle of its being readable. Please like this video, leave a little comment. If you'd like to support what me and Milo are doing here, we also have a Patreon, which you can also find a link to down below. And stick around for the poem at the end. without any further ado, here is Professor Brian Cummings. Great. Where are you joining us from today, Brian?
I'm actually in London. We have a London flat. Actually, we've been here quite a lot last year. So yeah, I'm 20 minutes from the British Library, which is always a nice place to feel.
Yeah, I think
Equivalent to me, I think. Maybe not
Yeah,
in the same house, I
yeah.
assume.
there's
I
a sort of
assume.
parasite situation going
Where are
on.
you then? Where are you?
I'm near Mornington Crescent,
Oh
so
wow.
up that direction.
Yeah, super.
Are you the
And you have an interesting. Is that a large frog in the background there, or have I mistaken?
There is a large frog wearing a hat.
Well, of all
We don't
frogs,
need to get into it.
frogs are famous for liking to wear hats. It's very
It's one of
frog-like.
their things, yeah.
It's
One of their
wonderful.
attributes.
And where are you, Jack?
I'm in Switzerland at the moment.
Oh, fun.
Yeah,
Whereabouts?
in Graubünden.
Oh gosh, oh, gorgeous
Yeah,
area.
just
Oh, mountains.
yeah, mountains. There they are.
You
It's
win. Jack wins.
yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, I love it here. It's so gorgeous. I mean, first time I came here, just I didn't want to blink,
Yes.
lest I lest I miss some of
It's a
this.
very strong childhood memory for me, the Swiss Alps, because my father had a work colleague who had a summer place in Aschii bei Spitz, which is in the Interlaken sort of area.
Hmm.
And I had, I was English. I had never seen these things. These extraordinary mountains with snow tops, and we used to go up on cable cars to go to the top of them. It was,
Yeah, and just the train routes as well. I
oh,
just it's astonishing. You're like,
absolutely
they don't
astonishing.
build the trains through the boring parts, through the
No,
practical parts. We're like, we'll go up there, we'll build it halfway up the mountain, so that you
I
have
had
just the most astonishing. You can't believe what you're seeing.
no, absolutely. I had a sort of I've been looking at well, I'm working on Erasmus very intensely, and so I've been looking at Erasmus manuscripts all over Europe, and there were some in Zurich and some in and lots in Basel. And then I worked out, well, my wife and I worked out we could just go by train between the two and go through some Alps, and yeah, it was stunning.
It's always worth it.
And
I
then
think.
the post bus, which is like,
Yeah,
have you been on a post bus?
yeah, the
They're
weird
really
post bus
wacky.
system.
They're really wacky. They're beautiful.
Yeah, some of these train routes, I could happily live on these trains.
Yes, so could I.
Like some of these, like 8 hour from Tirano to
Yes.
whatever to Davos. I could just live on that
Well, we're
route.
starting to do that a bit. So obviously, it's partly a plane avoidance thing, but you can go on long train journeys. You can, I've been from Amsterdam to Dresden. I mean, what a stunning journey that was.
Yeah, yeah. Around Dresden's quite beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
A favorite train line of mine is Dresden to Prague, which I've done
Yes,
a few times.
yes.
That's
And
that's
then in the other direction on to Krakow via
yeah.
Wrocław. Yeah, very
That,
interesting.
Yeah, gorgeous landscape. What a
Yeah,
great place Europe is.
the
Absolutely.
only issue when the train touches Germany, it suddenly breaks down, explodes, disappears, and you
So,
have to wait
so
for several
my
years
German
to get a
friends,
replacement.
so my German friends are telling me all the time.
Oh,
Well, maybe I'm blessed, or maybe they're complaining a little bit too much. I think
Well,
the German trains are fantastic. The Dutch trains, of course, are better, but
no, I having lived in Germany for what 6 years now, I agree with your German friends.
right,
It is
okay.
worse than you can imagine.
Where are you based in Germany? Is it
In
Cologne?
Rhineland-Pfalz,
Oh, yes, okay.
so yeah, not too far from Mainz, not too far from the birth of printing. It's
Yes,
in the air there, but we're in the wine region, so people are a bit too foggy-headed to invent the printing press.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny looking at that, like my region. I was just curious what kind of people came from here that I might have heard of, what kind of things happened here, and it's remarkably little. It's one of these classic places where the Carlyle axiom that happy are the people whose history is boring.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Interesting thought. Yes. So are
yeah.
you're involved with the Deutsche Shakespeare Gesellschaft, are you, and things like that?
I'm very uninvolved with the Deutsche Shakespeare Gesellschaft, but
You should get
if
involved with
they'll have me, yeah. I mean, I've been sort of one of the sort of strange translation projects I've been embarking on at the moment has been translating Romeo and Juliet's the Schlegel translation of Romeo and Juliet back into English. Um,
that is the quintessential modern academic project. I love that.
We need to know what it says.
yeah, and obviously trying to improve upon it where I
Yeah,
can.
absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
I mean, nothing like trying to improve on Shakespeare.
yeah.
It's very, very easy. I mean, the
Um,
one thing that's good about Romeo and Juliet is it's so astonishingly well written.
yeah, it's really
I'm
annoying.
glad, I'm
Every
glad
time,
it's been
every
there.
time I'm finished with a section, I'm like, okay, I'll look and see how he handled it, and then I'm like, oh damn,
Damn.
damn, this
But
is
still, really kudos to you for trying. I mean,
yeah.
but you should
um,
seriously, you should get in touch with the German Shakespeare Society. They have what is it? I mean, it used to be that it was one year in Weimar and the next year in Bochum.
mm,
Two cities less similar to each other one could hardly imagine. But obviously, Weimar is the one to go for because it's a great place to stay a few days in. But Bochum is actually a charming post-industrial city in a way that it shames Britain that nobody thought, okay, the coal industry is going fut. Let's reinvent, a city as an arts town. It's just
mm.
brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I mean Bradford's sort of trying that at the
Yeah, Bradford's
moment, but
nice.
with
I
yeah,
like Bradford in that way. And
yeah,
the literary festival's a very good thing.
yeah. So thanks again for making time, Brian. We start these conversations with a poetic epigraph.
Oh, great.
Milo's prepared a little something for us.
Super.
Yeah. So we've got Milton's On Shakespeare.
Oh,
What needs my Shakespeare for his honoured bones, the labour of an age in piled stones, or that his hallowed relic should be hid under a starry pointed pyramid? Dear son of memory, great heir of fame, what needst thou such weak witness of thy name? Thou in our wonder and astonishment hast built thyself a livelong monument. For whilst to the shame of slow endeavouring art thy easy numbers flow, and that each heart hath from the leaves of thy unvalued book those Delphic lines with deep impression took, then thou our fancy of itself bereaving dost make us marvel with too much conceiving, and so sepulchred in such pomp dost lie that kings for such a tomb would wish to die.
oh gosh, he had it, that boy. I mean,
Which is a
Milton, what a kid.
He's so good at rhyming, considering this whole anti-rhyme spiel at the
Yeah, but he
beginning
was
of
only doing it
Paradise
to show
Lost.
off. He was just doing it to say, "Oh, I can do this other stuff too."
Yeah.
and a
Milton's an
great poem
absolute natural.
about
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just thinking. I mean, I'm thinking in a way. Perhaps it's one of the ironies of our industry, the one that we work in. That Milton is an absolutely natural poet, and really fundamentally is a poet. And we turned him into something else, a kind of machine of political and intellectual interest, and obviously theological, philosophical, all sorts of things. That's great, but let's remember, he's a poet. That's what he wanted to be.
Yeah,
Very
no,
much. And
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, especially in Paradise Lost in academia, it's
Oh,
so political, so
oh,
philosophical, so theological, and
yes,
for me, the experience of reading that poem is just basking in the sheer music of it.
yes, absolutely. And a lot of comedy and a lot of playfulness about sex and life. And we've sort of lost all that as well by being determined to show that he more or less made the Civil War happen, which I don't think he really did. But
having said all that, we'll use him as a lever for academic pursuit
please,
now because it was not a poem chosen at random, but in fact because it's making this almost classic metaphysical conceit of
yes,
the monument of Shakespeare is
yes,
not something material but immaterial. It is the
yes,
work of the spirit as is the work of art. However, simultaneously he does end up mentioning Shakespeare's book, which I think, as will be the subject of today, is not a metaphysical concept, but a very practical, physical object in the world. And really, how much do we understand Shakespeare as the ephemeral theatrical artist whose works could have passed with him had they not been, written down, remembered, and rescribed?
Yeah.
And how much do we understand Shakespeare as the author of Shakespeare's Folio, the book that very possibly made him, or at least
Oh,
constructed
I
the
think without any
monument
doubt made him
of
without.
his memory, the big picture of him on the front. That's really what Milton's poem is
Yes.
about this transfiguring of the untouchable artistic frenzy into very touchable, codified, put it in your library, peel it
And
open
of
any
course,
day.
the poem
And
itself is placed inside the second folio, and having a second folio is itself an independent event. I mean, now definitively posthumous, even by a generation, but a sort of complete works author that you have on your shelf as. Yeah, as a monument, as he calls it, a living monument, it is, and the book is a living monument.
and it's
Quite right.
conveniently placed in the middle, really, I would say, not exactly chronologically, but of the history of the book. I'll put Shakespeare's Folio here. Beyond that, we're already in printing press era into the modern day. Before that, skip the printing press and we're in the different period of the book, the handwritten book, the handmade book. And it depends how far back we will take it. I think one question that's worth asking is
If you
what
like, yeah.
when is a book not a book? Does it need to be manuscript? Does it need to be papyrus? Can a piece of stone carved be a book? Where are you drawing the line there?
I don't draw a line. And actually, in the lovely book co-edited by Henry Woodhousen of the Oxford Companion to the book, he in the introduction there, they more or less say they're not going to define the book in the way that we would probably expect to, and I think that's partly because of the success story of the Codex. So the Codex in the early century CE, particularly between say the second and the sixth century, is a runaway success, um, supplanting scrolls and other really very imaginative and very interesting formats for knowledge, but coming up with this format which is like a pair of hands because it's designed to be used by a pair of hands, very portable, very usable. Um, but I think also it's become so synonymous with the idea of what a book is, obviously the paperback being our main model now, that we think that books ought to be codices. But they weren't always. Clearly, it would be absurd not to think of the Greek and Roman culture of scroll books as not being books somehow. And then once we've done that, if we go back to the clay tablets of the Sumerians, it's remarkably similar, in fact, to the page format of the modern book. I mean, often that sort of size. If you think about your laptop in front of you, roughly half of a laptop screen in terms of size, and I'm absolutely sure of this. It's already has the conceptual status of the book. And I suppose I would say that in two really very fundamental ways. One is that it's already technological. I think the notion that technology is a modern thing is an absurdity. The book is fundamentally technological, but also in something to do with its power as a physical object, a physical object which has a relationship to us, and the fact that it is different from us. It's an object that we hold, but in the act of reading it, that object holds our subjectivity inside of it. So it's a mirror process. I think this is just so fundamental to the way that all human civilizations have turned out to work once they found writing. So in a way, I think it's simply a book is a term for writing in some collective sense. It's writing which has a beginning and an end. So it's finite writing. But which in that sense places the contents in front of us as if it was in theory, a whole world into itself.
Is the book therefore humanly inevitable? Can we imagine humanity without the book? I mean, the book is independently invented by many cultures across many periods of
Yes.
time. But with humanity, with language, is the book the natural third step, or can we envisage a universe in which the book never came to be?
Great question. Completely unanswerable question, but I'll have it go. So, I mean, I suppose we want to take a couple of steps back here, conceptually and philosophically, for a moment. And I'm not making a new argument here. You'll recognise its sources straight away. But there is a bias in the history of philosophy towards the speaking voice, and there is a notion at some level that language only needs to be spoken, and therefore that writing tends to be thought of as being secondary and perhaps supplementary. And perhaps also, in that sense, also instrumental. Whereas I don't think that's really the case. I mean, first of all, we couldn't have any history of any human civilization without writing. We could in theory try to say things, and obviously archaeologists would immediately dispute what I'm saying because there's loads of non-literary artifactual evidence from the past, and it's absolutely powerful. I love these things myself. I adore going to archaeological museums. But at the same time, I suppose historians would admit that, of ancient civilizations, that there is a massive fundamental difference once you have anything in the way of a written record. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the anthropologists would say that language existed in a non-written form, probably for many thousands of years before it was written, before it became a physical thing. But I think in its way, it's as extraordinary a moment as the invention of language. And after all, many animals have language, so language could be extremely old in a human sense at some level. But the invention of writing, which must be a thing, actually, it must be invented. You don't have it accidentally. Apart from anything else, because it's semiotic, and it's that, as well as being technological, it's always semiotic. I think it is absolutely fundamental to the way that we think of a civilization working. Yeah.
Could you outline some of the ways in which human consciousness changes with reading,
Yeah.
or with books? What does this language that's frozen, that has beginnings and ends, that is codified, what does this do to us and our relationship to language?
Okay, again, there's probably two or three ways in which I might think about that. I'll start with maybe the most difficult, which is that reading and writing are mimetic activities. We tend to take the word mimesis from Aristotle. We tend to think about it in relation to drama. That's great. That's very, very interesting. But actually, I don't think even Aristotle means it fundamentally in terms of drama. He thinks of a language world as being in some sense inherently mimetic. And maybe the reading process figures it in a particularly clear way. That, we could go back perhaps a little bit further than Aristotle and think about Plato here. Plato is famously anti-writing, or at least he seems to be in the Phaedrus. But this is actually, Plato's just a very complicated writer, and of course he's a writer. He does know that he's
right, yeah,
and he does know that we'd know nothing about Socrates without him, or almost nothing. And he's actually writing in a period of sort of really interesting change in the status of writing in Greek society. And so I don't think he's anti-writing at all. I think that's just a mistake. But if you take, there's a beautiful passage in the middle of the Philebus, which of course is a dialogue about pleasure. And all philosophers, when they say, "Come on, Jack, Milo, what do you think? Do you think wisdom or pleasure?" Yeah, and the answer is always, of course, wisdom. That's a stupid answer, because the reason why we're talking about this is because what we really mean is pleasure. Anyway, there's this really, really interesting thing at the start of the dialogue about how an oyster can have sensation. But the oyster must be able to represent that sensation to itself, to have pleasure as such. That pleasure is inherently, in some sense, a consciousness of the thing that you are feeling. And then there's another section later on in the dialogue where effectively, it's a foundational moment. It's one of the foundational moments in the history of mimesis, although it doesn't tend to be talked about in that way, except by doing that. But because everybody goes for the Republic and against the anti-mimetic argument. But in the Philebus, he has a little discussion about how I think actually I might say that the soul is like a book. What a wacky thing to say. To say the book is like a soul, that's a commonplace, a cliche. I mean, an interesting cliche, but nonetheless a cliche. But to say that the soul might be like a book is rather counterintuitive. And in order to imagine that, he starts talking about the difference between thinking to yourself and thinking aloud, as it were, and therefore thinking with another person. And to do that, he says, imagine a person is walking alongside of you. Now, I think that is the metaphor of reading. Imagine a person who is, walking alongside of you, effectively is thinking alongside of you. And the beautiful thing, I think, the absolutely stunningly beautiful thing about reading is that it is that moment reimagined over and over again. It's not me on my own. I am reading this writing that's in front of me, which is the writing of another person. But this is inherently a colloquy. It's not somehow the writing transmitted to me. And again, I think this is something that we make mistakes in with philosophy all the time, that we think of it in terms of a communicative novel, and we're doing it all over again with the digital world. And again, I think we're wrong about that. It's not communicative. It is colloquial. It is involving two presences at once. So yeah, I've probably said enough about that. I suppose the second thing I want to say, which is actually related to it, is that reading gives a metaphor of presence, and your own presence and the presence of another person, and the similarity between yourself and another person, and also the difference between yourself and another person. And those, again, are things to absolutely treasure.
Yeah, it's the first things that I really loved about reading as well. I started reading rather late in
Okay,
life.
that's very
I read
well.
about honestly about fiction about 15.
Yes,
I went on to study English literature, but I
yes.
only fell in love with it quite late into my teens. Um, and then immediately went for quite heavy stuff. Like my first few books were like Crime and Punishment to The Lighthouse, like,
Great,
and
great thing.
but I immediately loved it, and I especially loved being in other people's consciousness,
Yes,
not just like in a film, you're looking at other people and you're imagining how they might be feeling or thinking, but it's like you're having their thoughts through your head, through your own mind. And that
you have to.
uncanny sensation was something I'd never had in life before, and which
Yes,
remains the main spice or addictive content of reading to this day, the main pleasure giving
yeah.
thing in reading.
What about you, Milo? What's the first book that you remember?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I can remember the childhood books, which maybe aren't quite worthy of the name. I
What's that?
remember very young reading The Hobbit. This was a
Yeah.
pretty crucial, a great book to be an early book to read, I think, because it's sort of line perfect. I'm
Yes.
I'm an advocate for Tolkien, but The Lord of the Rings is not line perfect.
No.
But there is something,
Especially the
for all
first chapter, which is absolutely, well, I just think it's awful. And stop me from reading the thing, at first, because there's this endless stupid birthday party where these are really annoying hobbits. Whereas I'd read The Hobbit before that, and I thought The Hobbit was stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, and so it's one of these texts that it's not just the story, and the story as a child is what you're there for. It's what's bringing you through what will happen, what will these characters do. But revisiting it as an older person, I realized, oh, it's actually the quality of these sentences. They're
How
just
can you tell? Is it in a hole in the ground that lived a hobbit or something like that?
that is the
Mm.
first line, yeah, which is
Because I mean,
hell
it is absolutely quintessential as the literary moment. First of all, just saying in a hole in the ground. So immediately you're imagining something. And then I suppose beautifully in that first sentence, nonetheless, you have a word you've never come across before, because it's a word that perhaps he didn't make it up, but it feels like a made up word. And it turns out to be a being that's like you, but not like you. And so you're there, one
Yeah,
sentence.
it's a great lead in a hole in the ground. Okay, I'm traveling in. There is a mystery object, but the word itself contains some kind of, at least for the English speaker, texture.
Yes,
Hobbit. Okay, you're not threatened by Hobbit. I'm not I'm in the hole in the ground. It could be something scary, but I'm not. I'm intrigued by Hobbit. It's almost playful. It's the Hobbit
It's
in the
no, it's an
hole.
amazingly playful beginning to a book. And
And
I
what
think that's one of the things that we often remember from childhood in that way. I mean, I suppose the first, I mean, my parents would read things to me, and I'm sure that would be the first encounters I would have. But this may not be the first book that I sort of really read for myself, because I used to go to the library with my father a lot. But as a book in my hands, as it were, as something that I possessed, was a second-hand copy of Roger Lancelyn Green's Tales of the Greek Heroes, I think it's called. Which begins with, perhaps not quite begins with, but I think almost immediately, with the story of Hermes and Apollo. And Hermes, well, Apollo is obviously Apollo. He's a super god. He looks like a proper god, and he's the god of all of the really cool stuff, like the sun and poetry and so on. And Hermes isn't. Hermes is a mischievous child. He's you in a way in the story as you're reading. And he makes fun of Apollo, and he gets under Apollo's skin. But I think, again, as with the Tolkien example, or for that matter, as with Crime and Punishment, the fundamental act is the act of imagining in such a way that you could be part of it yourself, even though you're not part of it yourself. And I think that sense of the imagination as being involving difference and selfhood at the same time is, well,
Yeah,
I've never lost that bug.
you really learn to define the borders of yourself through reading as
Yeah,
well. Because you're imagining what it's like to be somebody else. You're thinking as somebody else. You're experiencing as somebody else.
yes,
But then you do come across things that are not part of you.
absolutely.
And in the process of discovering those, you kind of discover the outlines of yourself, of
Yes,
your soul, if you will.
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm. And in the
and I wonder.
oh, go on.
I just, yeah, we're talking especially about a kind of not necessarily, but in spirit, first person reading and often private reading where you sort of absorb yourself into the text and relate with the character or the scenario or the idea. But I wonder if this is a somewhat later development to the early, almost declamative book, which serves, and this is an assumption on my part, but more of a script for speaking than a text inherently to sort of leap into. And I wonder if there was a change historically when the book became more a private affair and less of it's a record with which you can share to a semi-literate or illiterate audience as a literate giver. And I'm thinking of mainly the poets, people like Homer, where these texts are clearly written to be performed, but they are written. It's no longer oral, and there is a reason for it being translated there. And then a point at which we can then take the text independently, and we don't need the intermediate part where the poet is singing and we're going through the poet into the text, but sort of skipping the middleman and going straight into the author's conscious.
I mean, there is a profound moment of change in embodied in the two Homeric texts, whether they're by Homer or not. They clearly are part of an oral tradition of writing. Well, not sorry, we shouldn't say that. Oral tradition of composing,
Mm.
um, but there is something extraordinary about the way we receive them, which is that we do receive them as written texts, not as oral texts. And I mean, there's a sort of odd, and I'm rather taken by argument by a Greek scholar who's now out of fashion, but he argued that there is something spooky about the relationship between the origins of the Greek alphabetic script, which developed out of Phoenician, but is the first true alphabet in a European language, in the sense that it has vowel sounds and it has a full set of consonants, and they're all distinct from each other. As far as we can tell, the origins of that script and the origins of the Homeric texts is really quite chronologically similar. And its
Mm.
argument then was that actually you needed this kind of script to be able to write down this kind of stuff. Obviously that's it's an argument we can.
All this kind of stuff is so valuable that the need to freeze
That's
it, the
fun.
need to mummify it, like
That's
the
absolutely
Arabic in the Quran.
Yes,
It's just
absolutely.
little fragmentary language, and then suddenly,
Well, I think
whoa.
here we're getting on to what I think is a very fundamental thing, which is that writing has something of a sacred character to it.
Hmm.
Um, Religions tend to say, because well, they would say that, wouldn't they? It is that the Bible or the Quran is divine because the divine inhabits it. Um, could be true. But the extraordinary coincidence that world religions are almost always founded around complex textual tradition. Even in the case of Hinduism, which is the most obviously older than its own written phenomenon, as it were, and which has again, perhaps like with Socrates, a slightly ambiguous attitude towards writing as an ephemeral and problematic conveyor of religious meaning and memory. But then even Hinduism has, of course, its extraordinary texts. And I mean, I feel that the reason why this is all in common among all religions is because writing contains a kind of mystery, a mystery of presence, a mystery of impersonation, uh, and a mystery of meaning for that matter. I mean, how is it that a script actually means either the sounds that we say are the same as that, which of course they're not, very, very obviously, most obviously of all in Chinese, but also obviously in alphabetic languages when you really think about it. But so that whole mystery, as it were, feels divine, even if you don't have a religion.
Yeah.
Feels sacred.
And the mystery of a word meaning something becomes especially pronounced when the the thing the word means is God, or God created the word, or something extremely abstract and far away from your day-to-day experience. And um, or indeed can bring you face to face with your deity in some respect. I'm thinking of like loads of evangelical Christians in particular. They claim to have a really personal relationship with Jesus,
Yes.
a person that they only know, have only really come into contact with firsthand through a book, through this written account. Um,
Interestingly, in relation to your current work with Shakespeare, Jack, a translated book for most of them. I mean, they will treat a text written in a language that Jesus could never have spoken as if that's how Jesus wanted to mean stuff. Um,
mm,
It's part of the quality of the book is the abstraction from the person. I mean, we talk about the intimacy and the walking alongside, which is crucial, and it's always there. But equally, it gains a certain objectivity. And I think in the Christian tradition, especially in Europe, abstraction becomes almost the name of the game. I mean, you're yearning for a city far beyond your land in the distant east. It's in languages you can't comprehend, translated once or twice over to you through the intermediary of whichever gospel writer. But somehow, in being abstract from the people, from the city, from the man, you grow closer to it through this sort of objective, divine inspired text. And I wonder if there's this phrase, the religions of the book, used in Islam to refer to the Abrahamic religions. And we can call most surviving major religions, in some respect, religions of the or a book. And I wonder if those religions are successful for that reason. The religions without the book, the religions not of the book, have mostly faded or been superseded. And is it something in the technology of the book that gives certain precedence or light to the faiths? You can imagine a book for a pantheon, but there isn't one.
well, I suppose the counter example straight away would be Native American and Native Australian religions. And I'd be a bit hesitant of us giving too much primacy to written word there. But I think we could follow the similar lines of the place of storytelling within those religious frameworks, and also of abstraction. As far as I understand it, and I don't understand it very well, but I do. I'm deeply, deeply admiring of it. The native Australian tradition of the songline is both storytelling, but also an abstraction from storytelling, a storytelling which has a kind of deep metaphor within it, of spirit gods of various kinds, various animalistic kinds. And that is highly abstract thinking. Um, yeah, as is shown in what's called Aboriginal art, very, very immediately. If you take Kunwari's work, who was just exhibited in the Tate last year, stunning exhibition. You could also just see how your immediate framework of comparison in a place like the Tate, of course, is European modernism of the 20th century. But this is an art form which goes back, well, probably thousands of years,
And
5,000. You don't
I think
know.
a benefit of the book as well in the religious context is there's the notion of maybe the older world religions having, sometimes animistic or very materially based beliefs, worshipping trees or animals or objects. And while the religions of the book tend to position themselves somewhat more advanced or away from those traditions, they actually manage to draw them together because the book is, of course, as we've been saying, an object, and it can become the center of some kind of perhaps not worship but religious practice. You see, these books, the Quran is never placed like below head height, is something I hear, and people don't like it when Bibles are on the floor. There's a certain sense of real religious respect with these
Rabbis
texts.
have to wash their hands if they touch a page with the tetragrammaton on it.
Yeah, and
So
the again the Jewish practice of the Geniza, a sort of which is somewhere between a treasury and a waste bin, where you keep all of the holy word, all of the words in Hebrew. Never mind, they're not necessarily scriptural, but they're just words in Hebrew in a place because you can't throw those things away. And some of the earliest copies of the Quran have been found inside the walls of mosques. And the reason for it was preservation. They didn't feel it was right to as it were, just you to allow to perish something that contained a holy word.
and it's
Yeah,
curious that
again, I
what is
think that's a more widespread feeling that we think. I mean, that the Salman Rushdie, when he first encountered the fatwa, wrote this um, a beautiful lecture he gave, which of course he had to give in hiding, which begins by talking about how, because he's talking about holy books, and it begins by saying, in my family when I was growing up, all books were holy. If we dropped one to the floor, then we had to, say a kind of prayer and kiss it as we took it back up from the floor. That's when you were just saying, those rituals of the proper and improper places, the sort of sacred and taboo places of what you do with the holy as an object. Again, I think are highly profound in human. Um,
Yeah, and it's a transcending of the practical because you can just see a book as a record or a useful object
we
or a
do,
memory.
we do.
And yet it
Culturally, I think culturally we're almost proud of ourselves in trivializing these things, in making the history of books and of writing, or for that matter, the way that we use language, a much more instrumental and transactional thing than it really is. There is something extraordinary about the ability to be able to share speech in the way that we're doing here. Obviously, a narcissist, I won't name one of them, but there is a very famous narcissist who seems to be around a lot on TV at the moment. It doesn't seem to feel like that about language. Doesn't seem to share language. Simply seems to share. It seems to inhabit a single person's worldview. But actually, I think tragically, culturally, we're rather prone to think in those ways, as if it is about individual persons making their mark on other individual persons, rather than thinking about the intimacy and intensity of the act of exchange and sharing.
Yeah, and I think this tendency can, however, be, as all things, turned on its head, this sort of the worship of books. And I'm going to read just a little segment from Alexander Pope's Epistle to Burlington, which is quite
Ooh,
an amusing riff on this notion. His study, with what authors is it stored? In books, not authors, curious is my lord. To all their dated backs he turns you round. These Aldus printed, those de Soil has bound. Lo, some are vellum, and the rest as good, for all his lordship knows they are but wood. For Locke or Milton, 'tis in vain to look, these shelves admit not any modern book. And so here we have a lord who very much likes owning books, big fan of books, not a fan of opening them. So has kind of created the anti-library filled with these wooden backs. In a way, part of this religion of the book, part of believing that a book is an important and valuable or impressive thing. All of these could be invented myself, but it's good they're there. And it's the
I
sense
had this
where
as a mock-up just made for the purpose of this Zoom.
it's
They're all fake books.
Jack, where are yours? You've
Exactly.
clearly
He's got mountains. Oh no, we're not going
true.
back to the mountains. I'm feeling jealous again. Uh,
The mocked up mountains, just a painting.
yeah, perhaps
But
it
the
is.
sense where the book is a totem of the thing the book represents.
Yes.
And there is an even today, I think people like owning books. I
Yes.
think, I possess certain books I haven't read, not because I will never read them, but because I thought probably better that I have it than that I don't have it, which again gets into this very kind of old-fashioned magpie, pre-human, shiny thing, valuable object I must collect and display.
I'll share with you. Perhaps I'm oversharing here, but certainly showing my age. So, people of my age, academics of my age, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but our biggest fear becomes what are we going to do with the books? You see? So it's worse. Mortality is easy, but your library, that's a much, much more difficult thing. So it gets mixed up with retirement. And, you tend, I mean, unless perhaps if you're in a privileged position of being a fellow at Oxford College, maybe you can just keep your room, keep your books. Well, actually, often you don't, even then. But most universities, the thing you lose when you retire is your room. And of course, you don't care about your room, but you do care about your bookshelves. And so, what will you do with these? And I've had a really funny sequence of conversations where I've realized that the other person I'm talking to is just as, neurotic about this. Um, and it is, I mean, there is a pleasure about owning the books, yes. But again, I think perhaps we trivialize that too quickly by thinking about it as a commodification. I mean, the books are commodities. And I pay money for books, sometimes silly amounts. But I don't think of them as commodities. I think of them as part, in some sense, of my own library, which is modest and but is nonetheless the collection of all the things that I've chosen to have within my library. And one of the first questions that my students will ask me is, "Have you read all of these books?" And Derrida's answer to that question when a filmmaker came into his flat is the best of all time, which he said. And he said, "No, only 4 of them. Those 4 very carefully." And the filmmaker is a perfectly sophisticated person who's absolutely hoodwinked by Derrida's obvious total mockery. But it's a perfectly good question. It's very unlikely that any person has read all of the books in their library all the way through. They may have done, but that's not the reason why you have those books. Your books speak to each other, and I certainly have begun to realize as I get older that the books are there for a reason. And it may be that it's only in my 40s that I suddenly realize why I bought a book when I was, say, in my 20s. But it suddenly has its place. It needs to be there. And it's partly because it's conversing with another book on the shelves, and therefore in my mind.
My first part-time job during university was clearing out the libraries of dead professors.
Wow.
And they had me along as like, you
Give up
like books,
your current
Jack, and amazing stuff in there.
Give
I
up
mean,
your current project and write a fantastically clever novel based upon that experience. You could even call it The Books of Dead Professors, because I think that'll sell. But certainly, the idea of investigating, I mean, of course, Elias Canetti's
Die Blendung.
yeah,
What a novel. What a novel that
novel.
is. Yeah.
And it's based upon this sense of the fetishism of book collecting, but combined with this sense that we're all of us just struggling to conceptualize of how the book itself as an individual thing or a collection of books represents a sense of what the mind can be. And we care for that. It's deeply important to us.
And I enjoy the materiality of books in another sense. A classic trope that we encounter throughout sort of film and occasionally in writing is the Bible held in the breast pocket, which prevents a bullet from hitting the heart. And it's
Yes.
very practical. Whenever I carry, I'm currently reading The Magic Mountain, and I've got that in my pocket, and I know that's going to protect me
It's a
from
very
quite a
good use. Yeah, it's very practical because if somebody's trying to shoot you, and they probably are, then you've got protection. I've seen some of those. I mean, they're in the Imperial War Museum. They have a lot, of course. They have private memorabilia of all sorts of soldiers who died or perhaps didn't die in the conflict, and perhaps it was just a relative that gave the books. And there are plenty of. I was looking particularly at books of common prayer with bullet holes in them, and there's something extraordinary about that.
Yeah.
You know that Woody Allen, whom we no longer mention, in one of his early bits of comedy, he reversed it by using a bullet to protect himself from a Gideon Bible
Say what you like about his terrible films, his personal life.
Yeah. Well, that's an argument, and that is, of course, that is a rather intensely important argument about how far we're able to separate the art from the artist, and how far we want to.
Yeah, separating the Quran from the artist of God would be an interesting one. If it
Yeah, although I
if
suppose the
if you
whole conception of its formulation is working around that
yeah.
issue. Perhaps we should, we'll keep off that. But it is a big question with Shakespeare because people want to make an author out of Shakespeare to explain the works, and they have very little to go on. And I think it's a classic example of, if we turned out to know more about Shakespeare's life, we probably would write about him less well and with less intensity, because we're blessed not to have a life of Shakespeare.
Yeah, this is the great hypothetical in my mind is if we suddenly tomorrow in some dusty loft somewhere discovered a full authorized 100% legitimate biography of Shakespeare written at the time, it's absolutely real. We can see all his kind of real estate mogul business. We
Yeah.
can see him writing Hamlet about X, Y, and Z. What would this be a good thing, or would we three who've discovered this volume be forced to destroy it,
I think
knowing that we should destroy, yes, just knowing it will bring upon a greater evil than any good.
I mean, there's a number of things going on here, and some writers have written very, very well about it. So, first of all, there is the Borgesian thing, which is that there really is only an incidental relationship between the Borges who buys a cup of coffee in the morning and sits in a cafe reading his newspaper, and you, who writes the books by Borges. So that, first of all, we should make that distinction that the act of writing is a different thing. The most interesting thing about any writer is the act of writing. But we tend to write biographies talking about all of the other things that writers do, apart from write. And we tend then to make a confusion between the two because we assume that there must be some interesting relationship between the circumstances of writing and the actual writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and both writing and reading, if you're on the outside of the subjective experience, the subjective theatre, seem like really dull activities.
Yes, it is.
If you didn't know what the people were doing, if you didn't know what reading a book was or what writing a book was, when you see somebody at a table engaged in either activity, it would seem completely sort of arcane and strange and meaningless, like
Yes.
like trimming your fingernails or some other arcane and meaningless act.
I mean, one thing about that is that because we fetishize, I suppose, the writer so much, we tend not to think as much as we should about the reader. And for that matter, within the theatre, we fetishize the authorship of the play. And we don't think as much as obviously there are people who do this for a living. I'm not there is such a thing as theatre studies, but imagining what it's like to be a spectator is just as important as imagining what it's like to write a play. So I think there is something more communal about reading and spectating than there is about writing. I mean, I think I do slightly to upset my students. I shouldn't want to upset my students, but it's sometimes quite funny to do it. But if you're talking about writers, I sometimes use my master story, which is I've only met 2 or 3, people of genuine genius in terms of writing, and they've all. I mean, I won't say they were all shits, but they were all extraordinarily difficult people to live with at some level. And one of the sort of silly things that people do with writers that they love, I mean, I do it myself. I'm not complaining really, but is that we imagine them as being, a nice sort of, easygoing, witty, friendly sort of person who happens to be a literary genius. I mean, to be a literary genius, you probably have to be an almost pathological narcissist at some level in order to have that much concentration on that sort of activity. I mean, Beckett is an extraordinarily interesting writer and also had, a very interesting life that is worth reading, especially the parts in France, especially the parts in the war, and especially to do with the resistance. But nonetheless, I would not have wanted to be married to Sam. And there is a reason for that, which is that, that writing was an extraordinary time-consuming thing for him, which he found appallingly difficult, and he didn't really want to be doing it. He felt at some level he had to do it. But it's not fun to read that as the biography. The biography is the other stuff, which really tells you nothing, well, tell you nothing, but might tell you close to nothing about the writing.
Maybe every writer biography should just be an experience of their reading. Just then...
That would be lovely.
Yeah. Know exactly what Tolstoy read on what date and exactly the effect. If somehow we could in future get this sort of technology where we plug in to how people were feeling at specific moments in history, and you can go to Tolstoy reading.
Probably close to it, aren't we? With the your computer is perfectly capable of telling you what you've been reading on it. I mean, if we stop reading physical books, which we probably will in 20 years' time, I hate the idea, but it probably might happen. Then, if we were reading everything through a computer, the computer will not lie. So we may remember having read all of the works of Dickens, but the computer will reply, "No, darling, you actually never finished."
Nicholas Nickleby, you're 3 words from the end.
And this is what you were feeling 3 words to the end. But if you'd read the last 3 words, it would have changed everything.
It would have changed the whole opus.
Yeah. And this is a good fact about Martin Scorsese, which I think, Jack, you first told me about. During every film project, he also embarks on the reading of a great novel, not necessarily relevant to the film, but that would be an excellent biography of Scorsese. Just discuss the novel, discuss the film, ignore him and what he was doing, what coffees he was drinking.
What does Middlemarch have to do with The Departed?
Precisely.
I know is one of the pairings. Yeah.
One of the things that actually, and this is a slight, this is a contradiction of my theorem that great writers are not nice people. So Colin Thubron is definitely a great writer, and is also possibly one of the 3 or 4 nicest human beings I've ever met. But Colin says that one of the mistakes that people make about, especially about travel writing, is that they think it all happens in the experience in the moment of being in the place, and then you just start scribbling down what it is that you're feeling at that moment. Actually, a travel book takes him 2 or 3 years of research to think through and conceptualize before he ever gets there. And then there is an interesting conversation that goes on between experience and effectively reading. So, what you just said about the amount of reading that you need to do in order to be able to write is really interesting. And I think most good writers must be good readers.
Yeah, or readers who have like define what a good reader is, but are readers who take an intense, passionate, almost to the level of a human relationship, a level of feeling, a level of involvement and reciprocity between themselves and the books. I think you can be a great writer and completely misread things, completely
Oh yeah,
misunderstand
yeah. But
things. Maybe that's a condition
maybe we
even.
all misread all the time. In any case, I'm not against that idea. I do feel that something to do with the sort of writing that we're talking about, I suppose, imaginative writing, which almost seems to take for granted that you have taken pleasure in reading first before you do it. But I don't know. Of course, it's perfectly possible it wouldn't happen.
Mm.
Um, I certainly think it's interesting. It's much more interesting to think about Shakespeare as a reader than it is to think about the life of Shakespeare. And we have some chance of doing that. I mean, after all, the Stuart Gillespie's book called Shakespeare's Books, and there must have been other attempts to, because this often started with source study stuff, but actually you can do more than that. I think source study is the wrong filter for this. But there are books that we know that Shakespeare clearly encountered.
And plagiarized, and
Plagiarized to the nth degree.
yeah. How long did it take for Gutenberg's printing process for movable type to reach the British Isles? 'Cause it's in 1440-ish or something that it's there in mines, and then you've got and then the Rhine travel route is
It goes through the Low Countries. So Caxton, who is thought of as being the first printer in Westminster and in London, in the sort of late 1470s, early 1480s, came from Bruges, and
okay.
Bruges, he was already printing in Bruges.
Yeah, and do you have to like
It doesn't take
bring
very
the
long.
whole machine with you, or is it just you've got a sketch, you know how the
I mean,
technology's built now, and then you can do it at
it's a
home?
great question, Jack. But I mean, on the whole, a printing press is a pretty hard thing to shift.
Mm.
And probably more expensive to shift than to build a new one in a new place. I mean, I suppose the one case where you have some, well, not one case, but one case where we have some knowledge of this is with the Martin Marprelate tracts in the 1580s that which were very quickly banned, and so they did literally physically move a printing press from London into the Midlands, somewhere near Coventry. Um,
Yeah.
that's a,
And all these trade routes must have been like quite well traveled beforehand to get all the stuff that you need for printing. You need the paper. Where are you getting that from? You need the ink. You need all the copper
printing.
plates for the letters. And it's interesting that all of this technology is already there, or all of these trade routes are already there to accommodate for the sudden surge of activity that comes when the presses are first set up.
Printing adapts technologies from elsewhere. So, a primary example of that would be the press itself, which is sort of based on something like a wine press. Uh, the, the plates, there's a well-established, use of plates for artistic purposes, both woodcuts and metal plates, and so they're adapted to the printing case. But you're completely right to emphasize trade routes. It's one of the absurdities of bibliographical history. It's unfortunate, it just happens to be the case, is that they've been kind of motivated by nationalistic concerns. And so, you have the short title catalogue of all of the books printed in England or in English on the continent. Well,
Okay.
total misconception for a start, because most people take from that the short title catalogue somehow describes the books that were read in England in that period. And that's not the case. Most books were imported into England. And most books for the first 100 years would have been in Latin rather than in English. And so, a better way to study printing is to think about trade routes and to think about exchange. And, you just have to think about what are the cities that are most associated with printing. Well, there's two different types, but a major one are of major trade fairs and of interconnection. So Strasbourg, Antwerp, Venice, Lyon. These are quintessential trading and printing cities. The other one, of course, is the university press, which is a slightly different sort of model. Although even a university, it was a place of interchange.
Mm.
And I wonder with this change into the printed book becoming very quickly the almost universal book, the book you will encounter and meet other than in a very special occasion. And we've already widened the definition of book to more or less anything with continuous writing on it beginning
Yes.
and an end. But with the printing press especially, there seems to be a kind of profound change in the texture of the thing because we're now abstracted one more level. There was always a sense of a human scribe, or indeed the author, etching or scratching or writing their words onto a particular sheet of paper, which maybe they copy or someone copies, but we've got this sort of line of one impression to another. Here we have the intermediate machine, which can obviously still requires a lot of human labor in the early days, but is printing the same letters in the same way over and over again, which, in my view, gives to the book a sense of objectivity that it didn't previously have, because at least the arrangement of the letters feels less guided by particular human whims and maybe tendencies, but more by kind of, we've systematized it. And does this change the experience of reading? Does this change the experience of looking at a book, knowing it was made in several other copies in exactly the same way?
First of all, I suppose we should just have as a rider caveat. Medievalists hate us when we say this sort of thing, and they're right to, because certainly by the 14th, 15th centuries, manuscript copying is an industry. It's not a question of just an individual person happening.
It's like loads of guys in a room taking dictation at the same time.
And I don't think there would have been a big difference in terms of the numbers of copies that were being produced of Dante's Commedia pre and post printing. It's a highly literate culture, of course, in Italy. It's not like godforsaken British arts, but in Italy, where serious thinking and reading of poetry is going on, there were loads of copies of Dante in circulation. Petrarch, of course. So I'm not thinking. I think we're wrong, perhaps, to think that it's a difference produced simply by scale. Early print runs are often disappointingly small from that sort of point of view. But I think you're right, actually, Milo, to think of this in conceptual terms, that nonetheless, a printed book feels as if it's technological and feels in that sense as if it could be copied any number, an infinite number of times. Not true, but it feels as if it could. And religious authorities in the late 15th century and certainly Henry VIII quickly become very paranoid about the fact that they feel that the book almost comes out of nowhere. And then, for that matter, from a more sort of creative and productive point of view, if you take, I have to talk about him. Erasmus is on my mind all the time. If we take the example of Erasmus, Erasmus is only really imaginable as the kind of author he is in the world of print, because it gives him independent authority from either a monastery. He did spend time in a monastery, he did spend time in universities, but he did not derive his authority from his position within those institutions. He's in fact, he's an anti-institutional person who acquires the name of the author, which is something which you see on the title page of a book, or in due course in bound form on the spine of a book, and has a status as an author in that way, which is a very, very interesting thing. Even including the New Testament, where the Bible, of course, was thought of as a religious book, but suddenly there was the edition of the New Testament by Erasmus in 2 languages, where his name appears on the second line of the title page. I mean, it is a really interesting thing.
And are these kinds of figures, these humanist, big reader figures like Erasmus, like Montaigne, maybe you throw Shakespeare in there as well? Yeah. Are they kind of unthinkable before print? Because of, in a sense, because of this voraciousness of reading, or because of the cult of the author that can be built up around them?
Well, maybe it happens a little bit gradually, and maybe that transference from Erasmus to Montaigne to Shakespeare is an interesting one. Erasmus, obviously, in some senses, it becomes expert in genres which are already known, although he does transform them and make them much, much more visible and prominent. And they're not really the genres that we somehow would expect from him. So the adages are a very, very interesting example. So the proverb collection is an ancient thing. But the proverb collection is giving you a kind of, as it does with Erasmus, a kind of sense of, this is the key to the mysteries. I can understand. I mean, it was called by Budet. It was called the Book of the Sibyls. This is the book which explains everything, as it were. Of course, it doesn't, but it appears to. In which, interestingly, Erasmus, he did it over 10 editions over a 20 or 30 period, 30 or 30 period. Almost all his authorial life, he is doing new editions of the Adages. And as he goes along, he introduces himself as a commentator, as a person in the third person, as somebody who makes ironic jokes in relation to other things that are going on with it. And so it is the book as a kind of it's an authorial presence. And I'm absolutely convinced this is important to Montaigne, that the essay could not have been written without the adagia in front of him. It's a different kind of book, but in a way only superficially, because it turns the adage, which already was sometimes 30, 40 pages long, into the essay, which is more deliberately personal, and where his sense of persona as the writer is, well, how does that relate to the Erasmus model? It's more self-conscious and more sophisticated at some level, but therefore it also disappears in some sense, so that you have a book of an individual mind, which then Shakespeare can encounter and go, oh wow, that's really interesting. This is giving me interiority. And so I don't think it's any accident that it's in Hamlet or in other plays where you can see that he's finding a model for how does an introspective person look like and sound like. I mean, he sounds like Montaigne in one of his essays.
Yeah, and early Montaigne essays, in sort of the book one, that there's a lot more response back and forth with classical authors.
Yeah.
That like Cicero or Seneca will be quoted at length, and then Montaigne will have a little quip or aside or little remark on that, and it will resemble much more the Erasmus adage form, and it's in and
But then
gradually,
de l'expérience or whatever it might be,
yes.
third book, which is yes, absolutely.
By the third book, it's just what we think of now as the modern essay / autobiographical writing. This is a kind of interiority that you don't. Maybe I'm too underread in medieval and the classical literature, but feels kind of unprecedented.
Again, medievalists hate it when you say that, Jack. Learn to have a response.
And there's Augustine.
They're
There's
right.
there's I see individuals throughout history who have a deep encounter, a deep thinking very deeply about interiority and its presentation on the page. But before Montaigne, before Shakespeare, there's just it's less vivid. This feeling that I was talking about at the start of someone standing next to you, walking beside you, and
I'm not going to let you get away with this, Jack. This is not because first of all, Petrarch, God's sake, Petrarch. For that matter, in English, Chaucer is not only possibly my favorite English poet, but also he vividly imagines what it feels like to inhabit a particular personality, which is different from another person's personality.
The voices are wonderful in Chaucer, like the distinction between the voices in Chaucer. But I don't. Where's the interiority? Where's like the real like I'm thinking about myself thinking. I'm thinking about the various wills and drives within myself. The internal contradiction. Perhaps
it works more in dramatic terms because it is a proto-dramatic work, and so what you're doing is you're seeing the partner and thinking, you're inhabiting the partner's head, and then also thinking what an absolute monster he is at the same time. So that's quite a Shakespearean move, you could say. But I think I think Augustine wrote a reasonably introspective work, and I think it's been there for a long time in ancient sources. Plutarch is full of the imagination of what it feels like to be a person. For that matter, Jesus, is presented as something like an interior person, a very odd kind. The Gospels are very interesting form. When Jesus was on, I meant it's an odd form of interiority which is presented in the Gospels. But let's
Lovely.
face it, Jesus was really odd as well.
Milo said if you pick Jesus for your dinner party guest across all of time, then you're just going to be encountered with a really weird guy.
Yeah. It's always the type that's found. I mean, curiously, we always find a white one, which is really odd and off for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, Jesus is a sort of prototype for a certain sort of figure.
And I think part of what we're discussing here is whether the book as a technology, if it's first a sort of mirror of the mind or a sort of impression going from author into text, and then part of this conversation later on, but whether it's possible the mirror then looks back at the author and changes the way the author thinks. And so while you've started writing books to translate human language, human thought into replicable text, you then get to a point where you're writing a book to reproduce the effect of the compromise, of the translation of, idea to language to written text. And is it possible, or have we seen it happen? I mean, certainly if we get to the modernists and all the metatextual stuff, this is part of their game. But in a more general sense, do human beings start thinking differently when they think like a book, or they think with book in mind, or having read hundreds of books, try to put a thought together? Have we created a railroad, not necessarily a negative one, potentially a transcending one, that allows us to have these continuous, detailed thoughts in such a way that was not unprecedented, but at such a scale? Did books reformat the human mind, or is this just, as perhaps is clear with the interiority thought, a continuum, and human thought and books have remained more or less parallel?
But if we take the book back far enough, then we remove that. I mean, we just remove the teleology, and perhaps the teleology is perhaps instead we should amplify the sense that we get from the modernist case, and think, well, actually, maybe that's imaginable in much older civilizations than we thought it was, and maybe that's helping us to see that there is fundamentally something about the linguistic object, something like that. I mean, obviously, the big question, which is the elephant in the room that we're not quite discussing, is whether all of this is changing with the internet and with the ebook and with the smartphone, and of course now rampantly with AR. And so there's a whole set of questions that need to be thought through there. But I think at the moment we're struggling a lot to find good models for what we think is happening in the digital age. And we tend to make very excitable statements about how everything's changed, which I think is sort of both true and not true. But we also have used, and it's partly the fault of people who've made an awful lot of money out of the internet, is that they want us to have a much simpler sense of what is going on than really is. The classic case is Zuckerberg telling us, sorry, I'm showing my age, I care about Zuckerberg, but Zuckerberg said that what's so exciting about Facebook is it's putting people in communication with each other. No. What was clearly exciting to Mark Zuckerberg was the fact that he could mine knowledge from that, which was extremely marketable for him. Google had made the discovery first that there is a mimesis even in the model of the computer as an information system, which is that there's the user and there's two sides, there's two types of mimesis going on within the computer straight away. But actually, I think, I prefer to say, rather than that everything is different there, I think everything is different at some level. We certainly have got to really hurry up and think through what's going on here. But something like that was going on originally in the very idea of having writing in the first place, and perhaps in terms of language altogether, that it's a mimetic activity. I think we've ended up with a rather simple model of mimesis, which we teach in universities quite a lot, and I think we teach it quite badly, which is somehow we think of mimesis as a successful representation of a thing, and we then say that realist fiction, for instance, does that and believes in its own fiction, as it were, and then we have modernist fiction, which gets metatextual about it and shows us that there is something more complicated going on. There was always something more complicated going on. It's not just that Tristram Shandy, it is doing this definitely in 1760, but way back, and perhaps we could even say there's a model for it in the Odyssey.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the Odyssey.
There is the singer who sings as well as the actual narrative that you are encountering. And I think probably most of us feel, and I would say this is there in the text originally, most of us feel that the Odyssey is not just a fun story about Odysseus. It is an act of storytelling. And you begin to examine what storytelling is. And at some level also, it's metaphorical from the first line, where Odysseus is described as polutropos. So polutropos, which means many-sided or many-turning, or in Emily Wilson's translation,
complicated,
which I think is worst translations in the history of translation. But I love Emily Wilson's translation in general. I just think that word was a bad choice on the first line. But of course, it's true. Complicated is part of it. But I think more interestingly about polutropon is that it's creating the metaphor of what we are doing in front of us. That Odysseus is a mirror for us. Odysseus is the traveler. Life is a journey. You don't ever seem to meet the end of the journey until, of course, death itself. And in that sense, the poem is an endless digression from and delay of death in relation to the reading subject, as well as the Odysseus as a sort of prototype writer rather than just a clever warrior.
And this is why I find the ending of the Odyssey so fascinating, because it feels almost like it turns into a kind of modernist text way at the beginning of these texts. And I think in particular to Odysseus delaying his return, which seems to contradict our generic expectation of the mighty I am back, kick out the suitors, redeem my wife, all is well. But you get him skulking around the island, seeming to know once the adventure is over, it is over. And then withholding this moment, which feels interior, and it feels like the kind of thing a rewrite of the Odyssey would introduce, but it's already there. Way back then. Yeah, it feels like a complex emotion being expressed against the enormous typologies at work and the mythology being expressed. This man, and he meets his dog, and he goes in disguise and tries to look at life without Odysseus as Odysseus. Attends his own funeral. Wow, this is what Ithaca is like. Sounds me. Fascinating.
So I think in that sense, it's already mimetic in the complex sense, which is not built around two alternative formulae, both of which it seems to me incorrect. One is successful representation. What the hell would that mean, as it were?
Oh, yeah, the recreation of the universe.
Recreation of the world. Well, good luck with it. I mean, it sounds a bit megalomaniac, and the first Chinese emperor did it, but God, did it cause a lot of problems. But second false version of my thesis is the postmodernist thing of we know that. So we're inside, as it were, the deconstruction of the moneys. And I say this is a huge admirer of Jacques Derrida, and I don't like it when he's slagged off. But I think that his triumphalism in somehow showing how mimesis is undercut is actually could be turned round and say, no, mimesis is always this fragile relationship between representation and disillusion. I suppose, and those things are actually both present in the mimetic moment. We know that it's not successful, even as we are desperate for it to succeed, and that in some ways repeats again and again something of the pleasure and the melancholy of the life of reading. I mean, what more disappointing moment is there than finding you have finished War and Peace? I mean, it has completely taken over your life for, in my case, quite a long time, because I'm quite a slow reader. Maybe you two guys, it would take you about 2 weeks. I think it might take longer. Anyway, it completely takes over your life, and then it's over. And that disappointment in some ways is built into the whole experience of reading, that it must come to an end. But the beautiful thing is the thought that it might not come to an end.
George
This could
Orwell
be
describes at first reading War and Peace being irreconcilable that it was not infinite
Yes.
at the end, that he could just not spend the rest of his life with
Except,
these
like with
people.
Lord of the Rings, the worst chapter in War and Peace is the last chapter. So maybe Tolstoy himself was disappointed by trying to finish it.
Well, it's
Yeah.
Odysseus dragging his feet, reading the end really slowly, because if you just go down the page slowly, it continues to exist. And once you've reached the end is always the same. It will never change, but you can suspend that irreality just a little bit longer if you just as a human because reading it's temporal, it's in
It,
time.
it
You don't touch the book and it's zoop. There is a period of time in which you are ingesting and
takes time.
re-ingesting.
It takes time. It is an experience of time. And I suppose this is one of the many reasons why Joyce chooses Ulysses as his topos. It's a stunningly beautiful thing, a crazily maniacally narcissistic and egotistical thing to do. I can redo Homer, you know, Jesus, just but no, he does it. And then what he does is by realizing something at the center of the work that I think modern classicism has slightly lost touch with, if I may be forgiven for saying so. Yeah, he certainly felt this himself, that there were two ways of reading the Odyssey and Homer, and Stanford, who was one of his sort of acolytes, who then actually did what was for a long time the standard edition of the Odyssey used in England. Stanford recognised that there are two Odysseys. There is the literal one and the allegorical one, and it's the allegorical one which is the really beautiful one, and it's the allegorical one which Joyce inhabits. Even in the very moment, well, not quite in the moment, but just in the wake of Schliemann and the literalist fantasy of actually finding the face of Agamemnon or Helen in front of you. No, it's the imaginative moment of will in discovering those as figures that they don't need to have existed in order to be the most beautiful things you've ever encountered in your life.
Another would-be infinite book is the 1001 Nights, where the whole premise is that it must keep going in order to prevent immediate murder, imminent murder, and so the plots must just keep rolling on the back of the last ones, and the stories get more and more stories within stories, just to keep this thing going, to keep the process of speech going. And it feels very spoken. I feel like the majority of it existed in sort of an oral folk tradition before anyone wrote it down. And and even in this title, the 1001 Nights, 1,000 is so often taken as a sort of stand-in for eternity, especially in poetry. And then giving you 1001, it's not only eternity, but a bit more than that.
It's like the Beatles say 8 days a week.
Exactly. You can keep forever and a day, sort of that.
I think there's something very important in that, which is that finitude, but also the promise of infinitude, non-finitude, is essential to this act. And I think that's one of the things that's probably going on in the literary act altogether, whether it's the act of writing or the act of reading. There is some sense in which something non-finite, something non-measurable is being created. But of course it isn't. It is something finite. It will end. Unless it becomes one of those beautiful unfinished books like Kubla Khan, which is not even very long.
Yeah. And there's something very, very beautiful, suggestive, elliptical thing with these unfinished works, where they do suggest a book that just is as long as the universe, where all the atoms of the universe are just smushed together to keep this beautiful tapestry rolling.
So in the Commedia, I suppose it's achieved by effectively making it seem as if you could start at Canto 1 of Inferno straight away as soon as you finish the Paradiso.
I know the first and last letters of Ulysses are S, which is a reference to the snake eating its tail, apparently.
Well, there's also the thing which he said himself about the difference between Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake was that he finished yes in Ulysses, which he thought was the most indefinite thing he could. So was it? Which way around does he say actually? No, the most definite, the most affirmative thing he could do. And then Finnegan's Wake, it's the, isn't it? I think
it's a lowercase the.
Lower the case the.
Away, alone, a lost, a loved, along the.
Yeah. So beautiful.
Yeah.
Absolutely stunning.
I love the end of Finnegan's Wake. What a gorgeous! I've not read the whole thing. I'm not that way inclined yet, but good lord, the last few pages are gorgeous.
I think a rather nice thing that happened to me, so slightly accidentally, in my 50s was on my 50th birthday, my wife gave me a copy of Moby Dick, and I had read Moby Dick before, but I'd read it badly when I was 18, or thereabouts. And first sentence, I was gobsmacked. Ah, what a book! Where has this book been? And I then thought, okay, it's the 50s reread show. And I recommend this to everybody in their lives if they're lucky enough to get to 50. And you feel a little bit old when you get to 50, so you need a bit of cheering up. Cheer yourself up with the thought of, I will reread, in inverted commas, the books that I don't think I got first time round. And I feel I was a bit like that with Ulysses. So when I first read it, I was a dutiful student. I really wanted to understand every bloody thing in it, and I was trying to footnote it as I read it. Second time round, I just let it go. Let it go. Let it flow all over you. And I found myself laughing, giggling, reading some bits 3 times, going very quickly through other bits. I don't quite get this, but that doesn't matter. And I think you have to do that with Finnegan's Wake. It's stupid to read it as if it's written in the way that other books are written. It is not written in that way, and you have to experience it as the ultimate act, or not perhaps an ultimate act of free reading.
There's a man recorded the whole of it, so like some completely insane audiobook project, an Irishman in a. Which I think is free online. I think you can find it on Ubu Web. So I think if I do go into Finnegan's Wake, I'd like to have it on the page in front of me and be hearing it at the same time, because it's
quite a good audiobook. It would be quite a good audiobook. The only book of mine that's been done into an audiobook is Bibliophobia, and they started with the bloody acknowledgements. I mean, how could they possibly? I don't know. I'm very embarrassed about this, but the acknowledgements take about 20 minutes to read. By the time we got through that, absolutely zero people want to carry on. So there you go.
The thought has emerged talking about sort of the finitude of books. What if a book emerged? We didn't necessarily know how, when, or why. It is by one author, but it is of such length that it cannot be finished in a lifetime. Even if you're a Harold Bloom, 1,000-page a day kind of guy, it's known that you can start in the middle, you could do highlights, but you cannot finish the book within one life because you will die of old age. What would we do with this thing?
That's why Bloom reads so badly, is because he reads too quickly. Let's get that first.
He claimed 1,000 pages an hour. That's what he claimed.
Absolute absurdity. I mean, what will be the point of reading 1,000 pages in a day?
To do another great Woody Allen quote, I did a speed reading course, read War and Peace in 2 hours. It's about Russia.
I think that actually what Milo's just mentioned there is a very powerful idea behind what the book might represent. It's a Borgesian thing. He even writes a story about it, but there is a way in which every piece of writing ever made seems to be involved in some sort of loop, permanent loop, that will never quite run out. And certainly, once we learn to be readers, if we get the bug, we just never stop. We just keep reading. And we might, of course, we'll probably segment out each of those reading experiences into different books, because I mean that's how they look on our own bookshelves and so on. But there's another way, of course, in which when you read one book, you are also rereading all of the other books that you've read before that, in order to be able to read that book. And we can all notice moments when we understood something better because we finally realized that you need to read Hegel before Marx and not the other way around, or whatever it might be. But you intuited something in what is actually the later text without knowing the prior text. And then when you read the prior text, it feels as if you've read it before because you've actually seen how other people read it in the meantime. And in any case, most of us probably are rereaders as well as readers. We're a bit ashamed of it, and so we won't mention the fact that we reread books. But actually, rereading is a lovely thing to do. And I think in earlier periods, including Shakespeare's, rereading was probably the most common form of experience because he just wouldn't have that many books on the shelves. And so you would keep rereading the same thing. And rereading is a great concept. Erasmus writes towards the end of his life, it's a very consoling thing. He says, I didn't get Cicero until I was in my 50s. You're thinking, Jesus, even Erasmus is prepared to say he didn't get Cicero until he was in his 50s. But then he describes 3 or 4 different stages in his life when he has been reading Cicero for various different reasons. And so he introduces to you the concept of the reader over a lifetime, the reader of the same book many times over. And I think it's a consoling thing. But it also perhaps it feeds into this sense that Milo's been suggesting to us of the unlimited book, the unfinishable book.
There's the two melancholies of reading, and one of them sort of related to the rereading, which is forgetting. To have read a book, known that you loved it, remember some of it or a notion of it, but someone asks you to describe what happens in it, and maybe that's not so important, but you just can't. You couldn't explain the plot of one particular War and Peace subplot, and it's sort of it's like a loss. It's a tragedy. It's like at one point I could have reeled that off, and it was part of me, but it isn't completely obliterated, which is, as you say, with your always rereading. Sometimes another book says another thing to you because somewhere deep in the plastic brain, there is a leftover, a vestige of the previous book that you cannot describe.
Well, I think
you've read it because you own it and the back is all scarred up, but you can't describe what it is.
Although forgetting sounds as if it's a failure, actually there is something important and even rather beautiful about the ability to be able to forget. And I suppose I want to ask you two guys about this a little bit more, in the sense that you're much more inwardly part of this era than I am. And I'm a lifetime where computers happen to me at a certain moment. But I do wonder and fantasize and slightly despair and whatever it is, all three simultaneously, about where things even are now, where things will be in even 5 years' time. AI is so sophisticated, it's so unsophisticated, it's so stupid, it's so clever, it's everything all at once. But it is beginning to take over, and we're told now that we can still tell the difference between a piece of, as it were, real writing and a piece of AI writing now. But come off it, give them time, they'll get better. It'll be more difficult to make that distinction. And in any case, our lives will be, the lives of certainly people a bit younger than you guys, will be so consumed by, pre-consumed, pre-digested by a digital world. Is that making a fundamental difference, or is it representing the world in a new way, but it's also a way that connects back?
I tend to be quite apocalyptic about these things. I think that human consciousness is undergoing a fundamental shift for the worse. I think our cognitive faculties are shrinking at an alarming rate. Attention, I think we're going to experience it because the world's going to be run by people who've grown up this way. Me and Milo, at any rate, when by the time we're in the twilight of our years, we're going to see what a world actually being steered by by people who've always had these technologies, maybe even incorporate these technologies into their personality. They see these tools as an extension of themselves, the way we maybe see books as an extension of themselves. But I think the overall effect on the humanist tradition that sort of starts somewhere in the Renaissance, the tradition of reading, of thinking, of learning to experience interiority in these ways that are opened up by reading, is coming to an end in this generation. Is my feeling.
Yeah. I know. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm quite as apocalyptic just by tendency, by personality. It's a curious time. I'm curious what will happen. It's always a question of the plateau of any technology, because currently we're seeing the upward trend and it continues, but we only know it's plateaued when it has plateaued. We only know that the uncanny valley is insurmountable when we've attempted to surmount it and it cannot be surmounted. I think currently there is and I think what you say about telling the difference between a robot written or human written text is now a point of fallacy, because I think an interesting experience will be when someone, perhaps one of us, but someone in the world, I mean, it has happened, but someone of some gravitas weeps at an artwork created by a robot, not necessarily realizing. Because, of course, if you go into the robot art realm, the robot sentence, you come in as an enemy. At least I think we might come in as an enemy. But if you just encounter it in the wild, assuming it was made by a person or making no assumption whatsoever, and you are moved deeply by it, and we can create the excuses that the fact it is moving comes from its various rearrangements and thieveries of human-made products. That's how it works. It's how a lot of creativity works. But to have been authentically moved by the thing, even if the thing itself contains no real semantic meaning because of how the systems work, it will be a curious moment. And I think the alternative to the Jack viewpoint is it creates a new generation, or at least a counterculture of extreme discretion, of people who become very wary of all things that they see, who become very careful about where things come from, and the culture shrinks in a way. Instead of it being infinite everything all the time, which is the current way of life, there will at least be some people who become very suspicious of infinite everything.
Yeah, the canon shrinks till all we've got is Homer and the Bible or whatever. This is all we can trust.
We're sure of these two.
I certainly recognise something from both what both of you have said. I mean, I do tend towards the apocalyptic at the moment, but then that's been after a lifetime of trying to resist apocalypse. I'm an atheist writer about religion, so I don't really like apocalypticism at all, and I'm suspicious of it. And I suppose one reply to it is that people have always tended to react to new media in this way.
Yeah.
Which including the printed book. For that matter, Ashurbanipal, Sardanapalus, we call him in the Byronic title, in whatever it is, about 700 BCE, who was a monster emperor, and who created not the first library, but in some sense the prototype library of everything that contains all of the thoughts of everybody alive in the kind of mad dream that the US government is definitely trying to eat up at the moment. So that's been felt really for thousands of years. And so perhaps what should give us hope in that is that in some sense, all writing expects to be disassociated from its own origin and its own maker. It is iterable. The whole point about writing is that you could read it in something like the same way if you had no idea of what its origin was. After all, in some sense, that's what we have with Homer, who only very liminally exists as an author, and I think slightly ridiculously. But I think we should call it the Odyssey author and the Iliad author. I think it's perfectly plausible that there were two authors. I don't know. I think it's perfectly. But we have, in an odd kind of way, we have increasingly fetishized authorship through probably the era of print. Um, and then in a new way, in the digital period, that's really counterintuitive because the digital age would seem to really get rid of it. But instead, we're living in a period where we prize authenticity and experience, and we attribute works to their makers in such a way that we then think it might be dodgy to listen to a Michael Jackson song or whatever the example is that we
Yes, yeah.
do. Whereas perhaps what the digital age promises instead is a way of being able to relax a bit more about point of origin or authenticity of the maker, and instead revel a bit more in the shared experience of deeply multiple readers of the same thing.
Yeah, Chartres
It's the
Cathedral, no
greatest.
signature, just
Yeah,
Yeah.
pure
absolutely.
experience. Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Or indeed nature itself. You know, there's no signature on these Swiss mountains out my window at the moment.
Yes,
They're more beautiful than any painting I've ever seen.
yes. Although there is a geology and there is a set of signs of origin to be interpreted, but no signature necessary for that. The signature, in a
And
way, is an artifact itself, which we've created as somehow being terrifically important. I mean, just think about that way in which, despite the fact that it should be easier in life now to do certain things, they're more difficult because they invent more pass keys, which you've already forgotten, or you have to have two apps, which both. Sorry, I'm sounding like a person who's getting deeply. I was simply trying to do something to do with the inland revenue yesterday and finding that I needed to have two apps open whilst also using my phone. Now, that meant I had to, in some sense, to have three texts available simultaneously.
Mhm.
And I wasn't up to the task, so I was very unhappy.
The Germans are
Oh,
wonderful at
it's like,
experimenting with these sorts of mad scenarios. In the Philip K. Dick
yes,
novel Ubik, you get this vision of the future where it's hyper advanced, but everything's deteriorating and nothing really
yes,
works. You've got to enter like 9 passcodes before you get into your apartment, and you have to pay the door in order to open the door. Everything's monetized, everything's
very
being
close to
filtered.
that.
Yeah.
yeah, Kafka just rewrites himself
Yeah,
Uh,
constantly forever. But we were recently talking with a man who knows a lot about medieval travel, and it was funny to see a lot of these things go way back. Venice was always this kind of a festival of commerce and people getting fined for sitting on stairs. We didn't invent this. We've maximalized it
no,
quite
absolutely,
beautifully.
completely agree.
Yeah, I will preface my apocalypse comments from earlier by saying I owe my a lot of my reading to the internet. I owe a lot of the canonicity, the knowing what to read next to the internet.
Yeah,
You know, Googling 100 best books ever, like, okay, War and Peace is on there, that'll be the next one. You know, my reading list as a teenager that I was developing was very internet filtered in terms of building canonicity,
okay.
and that it's kind of an important thing in to really steer you, especially if you're of a certain temperament like mine, where I do like having the best of something. I like or having some level of authority in that respect.
Talking about patisserie and gelato, I'm absolutely with you on that.
Well, it reminds me of a story that my dad used to tell of when he was in school in the desolate north of Hull, a bookless
Wow.
land. To this day, they say. Um, no offense to the Hellensians watching, we love you. So a bookless land, desolate, and civility never yet reached there. And he was once given a homework assignment as a young boy to name the seven ancient wonders of the world, and he did not have a book that mentioned them.
Yeah,
There wasn't one in the school library. So
yeah.
he didn't know and couldn't find out and just came into school the next day, nothing written, because he had absolutely no means of discovering what the seven ancient wonders of the world were. And that was sort of the end of that inquiry. And you can sort of, I take it very much for granted, and of course those who live within or near large libraries, that a lot of this stuff, it's there if I wanted it. But yeah, so I think I do lean on as a crutch the sense that any sort of wisp of curiosity I have, or how many books did Dostoevsky write? I know it immediately, not a problem.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there is a not so distant world where you could quite easily just not have access to any of that, and it does kind of stent curiosity, I think, to just think, well, there you go.
Yeah, knowing it immediately kills the curiosity drive a lot of the time. Like, why bother looking up, yeah, the seven wonders, seven ancient wonders of the world? They're there. Someone knows about them. We have these universities. There are people there who know them. It's not my business. And having the crutch there, having information readily available in like nugget form, in sort of a very streamlined, sans serif, soft, smooth form that's readily digestible, makes the knowledge less interesting, and you get less of this reciprocity that
Yeah. Yes.
you get with more gnarled, strange. But like if you have to look through a book for specific parts of information, you might accidentally become curious about something else. You might have this beautiful distraction that you get as a reader. I didn't realize I was interested in, I don't know, Byzantine erotica or whatever it might be, but
But I suppose Wikipedia is a great version of that because those who are easily distracted do end up accidentally ingesting the entire history of human culture because of all the blue hyperlinks. You're just reading about, the Byzantine erotica. It's like, hang on,
You follow them.
and China
I,
erotica.
I resist the hyperlinks, and just try to ingest that one article. But I mean, actually, this is a conundrum, which is an interesting thing in itself. That if you compute the number of kilobytes that the Library of Congress, in terms of its physical books, what that would contain, it would be a very small deal in comparison to the internet. I mean, that must be partly because the internet is constantly repeating things and plagiarizing in slightly similar, slightly different forms all the time. But it's an interesting conceptual thing that never mind that Harold Bloom was lying when he said that he read, I mean, academics are always being boastful. Never mind that most, even quite medium-sized libraries of academics, if you do the maths, are probably beyond the reading life of the person who is in that room. Beyond that, we have the unknowability of the library. Any decent-sized library is far too much for any human being to read. And the Library of Congress, another power of n on top of that. But the internet now, it's just off the scale. That's sort of beautiful, possibly very frightening.
Yeah, the man who sits down, I'm going to read all of the internet. I will start at the beginning, and I'm just
purgatorial punishment for the human race.
Yeah, you just got to scroll through and read every single word up there at the time
and watch
of your
everything.
death.
You got to watch everything as well. Yeah.
I once had a chance encounter with my friend Jeremy Moore, who late lamented Jeremy Moore died about 25 years ago, but was a very brilliant young Renaissance English scholar at the time. And I bumped into him just outside or in a lane adjacent to the Cambridge University Library. And I think that Jeremy said to me, going through the short title catalogue, and I've just got to be. I was thinking, well, what the hell do you mean by that? And unfortunately, I can't ask Jeremy now whether he meant he was simply, ticking off he had seen all of the STC numbers in A, or whether he really meant that he'd read all of the books or looked at all of the books in A. But it was, of course, a service call.
And he's walking away from you, like a bus between you. You're yelling, "Did you mean that?
Did you mean this?" Exactly. Well, it was. That's why the story has stayed with me.
And brings me to the second great melancholy of the reader, which we've been essentially poking at for a while now, is that you can't read everything. And that unbeknownst in the moment, you are selecting a limited number of texts and you are
Yes.
unselecting certain presumably great and infinitely joyous texts you will never read. And, maybe as a youngster, you can think, they're all somewhere in the future, but they're not. Some of these great tomes or small tomes or obscure or well-known, some will slip past you. And so you are you're building up this tapestry of your own read universe, and then you reread and you go deeper into some texts and less into others. And I remember a somewhat apocryphal date being provided, and I can't remember the number, but it probably doesn't matter, at which point you could feasibly have read every published work in English. And then there's a year that came by where you could no longer do that because just too many had been published.
Probably about
And
1505 or something like that. Yeah.
1505. So if you're alive in 1505, you could say, I've done it. I'm on
Finished.
I'm on
Mission
top of this.
accomplished. Yeah.
I can do something else with my life. Whereas now we're in the thrall of it, the throng of it. We can't. Choices have to be constantly made. What way you will go, and again with the internet. I mean, the internet, it feels less like a completionist event, but presumably, 20, 30 years ago, there were people who'd more or less seen what the internet had to offer. All 12 websites. It's all right. Or like those few surviving people who've seen every episode of Coronation Street. This cannot be repeated now for various reasons. But there are still brains among us that contain the entirety of Coronation Street, and it will be a sorrowful day when they pass.
I mean,
But it's
I did a sort of completionist task during, and it was partly a lockdown, an ancillary aspect of lockdown. So it was a weird thing for me personally. It was a weird thing for everybody, but it was a weird thing for me personally because I had just got a research grant, and it was a 3-year research grant, and it was to write a long book on Erasmus. And of course, to get the grant at all, you had to do this timeline of where you'll be in, which library you'll be in, on which date, and so on. And suddenly, no, I'm on my sofa. What am I going to do? And I had to think laterally a little bit. It wasn't that lateral, but I just thought, okay, I'll start reading Erasmus letters because I can do that. The PS and H.M. Allen's fantastic edition of the Latin letters is on Oxford Scholarly Editions online. So there, I had it. And so I started reading in the year 1500 because that's the year of the first edition of the Adages. I thought it'd be quite interesting to see what Erasmus was thinking day by day in the year that he produced his first famous book. That'll be a fun project. Okay, finished 1500. Well, let's have a think about 1501. That seems the natural next. So I was carried on doing it. And then I started reading backwards before that. And then I started reading on again. And then I thought, I could read the whole of the letters if I wanted. And I started doing the same thing with the adages. At first, I just thought it would be an interesting task in a slightly Harold Bloom way to read 500 adages. I'll read the first 500 adages. Bloody hell, that took a long time. But then once I'd done it, of course, I had this completionist fantasy. So I did read all of the letters and all of the adages. And that effectively was my research project. Fabulous way of reinventing the research grant was actually doing something genuinely useful as opposed to something you can get money to do, which is a slightly different thing. But it did leave me with that. In a way, these sorts of fantasies of incompletion and melancholy that we've been talking about, that I was desperately sad and actually put off reading the last 75 adages because I could not bear to actually finish them. Also, I suppose in another direction, the more letters I read, the more fragmentary the letter seemed to me and more ephemeral the letter seemed to me as a genre. It's been turned into a way of understanding the whole life of Erasmus because there are 3,000 surviving letters and that seems like enough to know a life. But it isn't really. And Erasmus did not think of the letters in that completionist sort of way. He didn't even organize them chronologically in his own editions of his own letters. He thought of them, what he gave them as a character instead was to say that they were an image of, I suppose, of everyday life, of the abundance, the copiousness in Erasmus's terms of everyday life. And perhaps also in that sense, the ephemerality of everyday life. And the adages, again, in a similar way. It's a collection of all of the known sort of iterable phrases in Greek and Latin, So you don't just do a commentary on everything that's ever been written. You isolate things that have been repeated, mainly from one writer to another.
Mm.
So Plato cites it, but also Cicero does later, and in fact Saint Jerome does. And then you start to work between them. Now you could say that there's an encyclopedic tendency within that, and it sounds a little bit like Casaubon in the first part of Middlemarch. It turns into something else, which is that I think Erasmus is certainly conscious of, and is representing to you the impossibility of your own project. You can't know all of ancient learning. You can want to, and the desire for it is very powerful and motivational in some sense. But actually, what you find, the more you read, the less you seem to have read. The more it seems like an infinite series of Rabelais' islands in the fourth book of Gargantua. Yeah, and that's melancholy, but perhaps that's okay. And maybe this internet future is going to be, awful, but in its way, okay. And we will find new ways of inventing and self-inventing ourselves through writing.
Yeah, like little islands anywhere. I just think that a mostly illiterate population, I tend towards totalitarianism.
Yes.
That's sort of my thought when you've got a population who not only it's not that they can't read, but it can't go in anymore. At a
Yeah.
certain point, if you've been training your mind on these short span attention dopamine explosions for long enough, the capacity to read a book vanishes. And these are the kind of people who put you in concentration camps. This is sort of my main anxiety about mass illiteracy. I think there are genuinely very humanizing instincts that come with reading. We talked
Yeah.
about writers all being monsters. I mean, fair enough, but I think
No,
reading reading. I think is
there
essential
are
for
worse
empathy.
monsters than
Like that degree of intimacy with another person's consciousness practices empathy to an extraordinary extent that you only get in brief enlightened flashes when you're not reading. Yeah,
Well, I suppose this is in some ways, I mean, sort of the example that you've given of the concentration camp. This is Primo Levi, and his beautiful representation of what it is to live in a world, among other things, a world without books. But more importantly, that a world where the book has been deliberately removed, so that the world of the inmates is reduced to the merest nothing, and that is the idea behind it. That most, of course, are simply annihilated, but those that are left behind are annihilated in another sense, in the way that they are given the most meager food and an existence which seems to have nothing outside of itself, and therefore no frame of reference to enable you to live inside your own mind. And Levi represents an extraordinary moment of connection with one of the other inhabitants over trying to remember Dante's Commedia together, trying to teach it to each other, as it were, to try to reconstruct what a real world, in other words, a world of imagination, could look like in the place where imagination has been quite deliberately destroyed. And I suppose on a different scale, perhaps a lesser scale, maybe all of us are feeling a little bit of that in relation to the political landscape that we're living in now, which seems to be, again, quite consciously Philistine. because the supreme misleader, as Rancière calls him, it is the person without books, the person who is building a presidential library who has never had a library, who is believed never to have finished a book. And so, in some sense, culturally, our survival seems to depend upon an opposition, mutual opposition, which might be founded around exactly reading books, and therefore having a better sense of fake truth than the one that we're presented with.
Ryan, do you mind if I just pop to the loo? Just a little 5-10 minutes section at the end to round us off, but
Okay.
I've been holding it for quite a while now.
You're forgiven.
Nobly done, nonetheless. Obviously goes into the mountains, I assume.
It's not just the mountains. His flat seems gorgeous with all its use of wood. Those bits of those steel joints between. It's a modern.
Yeah, the Swiss are living in a kind of future, I feel.
Yeah,
Here in our London hovel, we can't comprehend it.
One of my earliest memories of, not quite earliest, but earliest memories of Switzerland was the dishwasher. My God, a machine that washes dishes, and even for that matter, a shower. I was brought up. I was brought up in Birmingham, which is very comparable to Hull, and yet there were bathtubs. So this was, late Birmingham rather than prehistoric Birmingham, but nonetheless, a shower, dishwasher, things that work. Yeah.
Yeah, Britain had an interesting period of strange dishevelment for the many decades after the Second World War. It's sort of
Yeah.
hard to comprehend it. You get the
Deliberate.
pre-war largesse,
Yes.
and you get the sort of now same as all of Western Europe. But there was that long sort of 50s, 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
even 80s, where everything was sort of filthy
Yeah.
and no one knew what they wanted to do with their lives, and it was just mass sort of cultural depression, which produced some interest. Philip Larkin popped out, but a little bit on the
Oh,
downside.
Blair, Philip Larkin, but the Beatles popped out and they were fun. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Sorry.
mean, we were just peering at.
Larkin. You carry on with Larkin. It's absolutely fine.
I can take my Larkin, but sort of the spectacles and goggles looking over at the magic land of the United States of America and Elvis and music and vivid life and sort of injecting it into post-industrial. I mean, you were talking about it earlier, the failure of Britain to invent the post-industrial town, slight exception of Bradford. They're just, yeah, it's quite grim.
Yeah.
But maybe it always was. Maybe it's just the English texture has always been a little bit grim. What do you say of that, Jack, from beautiful Switzerland?
The English texture is indeed quite grim,
Yeah.
especially the desolate north. Although York, like around the posh bit around York, is glorious. The bit north of York on the moors. I was in the Tristram Shandy village for my 30th birthday last year, Coxwold.
Yeah.
What a gorgeous place that is. Goodness me. I'm really jealous of Lawrence Stern's life. I was thinking of joining the Lawrence Stern Society in order to be the guy who gets to live in Shandy Hall, because they elect a guy to live there permanently. What a life he's living. Wow.
Absolutely. Now, when we were choosing somewhere to live in York, we chose somewhere that was already on the A19. So you just head straight out up toward the direct route is the moors, and you're heading towards Whitby via the moors. But if you take a little kink to the left, you can go into the Dales, which is stunning as well.
Yeah, I love that shelf of the moors. I mean, it's the landscape I saw growing up. I'm from like just a bit north of Leeds, so that you'd see that shelf of the moors and the little white horse all the way from the village where I grew up.
What village was that then?
Fauna?
Okay.
Yeah, no. On the sort of Leeds Wetherby Road.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Finitude of books. Do you have any strong recommendations of books written in your lifetime that have like particularly gotten into you, become a part of who you are?
Well, the book, I suppose, that really did that, in terms of a work of fiction written in my lifetime.
It can be poetry or anything
Well, in
else.
this case, it was Beckett's Company. And it's partly because it came out when I was an undergraduate. And so, okay, you're already aware by that stage of living or dead writers. I do remember Auden dying vividly as being a really important thing. Um, but, Auden nonetheless belonged to a previous generation. Um, Company, partly just the way that it is written, the way that it encompasses a sense of the single human voice as the only existent thing on the planet. But again, in the same way that we talked about, immediately twists that to imagine itself in the second person, third person. Anyway, it's a stunningly poetic piece of work. It is a piece of poetry. It's a prose poem.
Mm.
It was also one of the books that I most vividly remember teaching, my first 2 or 3 years of teaching down in Sussex, between Brighton and Lewes. And I had the not complete good fortune, because it was planned, but I had the good fortune of co-teaching with Gabriel Joscovici, and we taught Beckett together for a term, and reading Company on the train on the way down, because I was commuting from London at that point, and then inhabiting it. Yeah, and I suppose that would be the work I most centrally mention.
Mm. Yeah. And could I just read you a poem that I wrote for this episode?
Please do.
Before Gutenberg, books manifested instantaneously in gusts of placenta and flames. There were no authors. God breathed books, including the book containing all books which do not contain themselves, into the fertile, bird-shaped clay. There was not yet a distinction between reading and being. One only had to climb into a cave or an infant canyon and imagine Gregory S. Paul's Princeton Field Guide to Mesozoic Sea Reptiles. For that highly instructive volume, a must-have for prehistoric reptile enthusiasts, to print itself directly on the atoms within you. Gutenberg's innovation was to slow printing down to a crusty, laborious pace, thereby rendering the ink of the books more pregnant with time itself, thickening their veracity. The longer something takes, the truer it is, and the statement lasting for eternity, though inaudible to time, is the only means of accounting for it. Time blackens ink, and the oldest of all books is the inside of a closed eye in a windowless room. Not only must modern man wait several hours for even a rudimentary guide on ancient sea creatures, but, in an infuriating innovation, must wait for those creatures to be discovered. Modern man must wait for science to drag itself up from the primordial ooze, a metaphor he does not yet understand, before manufacturing books which understand what he does. Knowledge became what books once were, dollops of raw mind, trickling down rock faces, or swaying in reeds, communicating something not particularly urgent, a sunrise over drowned forests, or a smiling child, the indispensable or the unutterably tender.
That was beautiful, Jack.
Well, thank you very much.
You have absolutely got a talent. Lyrical, but also very philosophical. I really enjoyed that. Time blackens ink.
A shout out to Gregory S. Paul's Princeton Field Guide to Mesozoic Sea Reptiles, also necessary.
I love that.
A fine text.
All right, but yeah, really wonderful talking to you, Brian. This was a great one. Really loved having this chat.
Well, I enjoyed it enormously, and I find you to really fruitful interlocutors. You really ask questions. You think as you ask questions. It's been a super conversation.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Wish you a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, Brian.
Great. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Cheers.